Hi everyone, today I'm going to be reading George Brown Class Clown Trouble Magnet Chapter 3. Let's get started. Chapter 3. George saw the sign the minute he and the other 4th graders walked into the cafeteria at lunchtime. Cool, George said. A talent show. I painted the poster, his friend Chris said. Who's the creepy-looking lady on it? George asked. That's supposed to be Edith B. Sherman, Chris told him. Then he asked, so, are you going to sign up for the talent show? George shrugged. I guess. You're not going to skateboard again, are you, George? Louis said really loudly so everyone would hear. Mike and Max, who were like Louis' shadows, started to laugh. George made a face. Skateboarding in the school hallway hadn't been his fault, but of course, he couldn't tell Louis that. Louis would never believe there was such a thing as a magic super burp. Who would? Maybe we could be superheroes, Chris suggested to George and Alex. I could be Spider-Man, Alex could be Superman, and George, you could be Batman. Chris had more superhero comic books than anybody George had ever known. He was even writing his own comic book about a superhero he'd made up, Toilet Man. What would we do as superheroes, Alex asked. Just stand on stage in old Halloween costumes? We could attach our sleeves to wires and some of the other kids could pull us up in the air, Grace told him. That would be really cool. George wasn't sure. What if the wires broke? No way George wanted to go from Batman to Splatman in front of the whole school. George sat down at the lunch table. Chris and Alex sat on either side of him. What did your mom pack today? Alex asked George. George peeked into his lunch bag. A bologna sandwich, he said, and a banana. I got ham and cheese, Chris said, and a bag of peanuts. I have egg salad, Alex told the boys. Anyone want to trade? George and Chris shook their heads. I know egg salad is the worst, Alex admitted, sniffing his sandwich. It kind of smells like the bathroom after my dad's been in there a long time. George and Chris laughed. They knew exactly what he meant. George looked down on his bologna sandwich for a minute. For a minute, he thought about poking holes into 2 bologna slices and putting them over his face like a mask. That would totally crack Chris and Alex up. Chris would probably call George Bologna Man or something. But as George peeled off the bologna slices, he caught a glimpse of the cafeteria lady. She was staring right at him. Cafeteria ladies definitely didn't like masks made out of bologna slices. They took food really seriously. Besides, bologna masks were something the old George would make. The new and improved George didn't play with his food, so George closed the sandwich up again and took a bite. There's a game of killer ball going on, Alex said, as he and Chris and George went out to the schoolyard for recess. You guys want to play? Killer ball was a game Louis had invented. It was kind of like dodgeball. We always lose, Chris said, because we're never on Louis' team, Alex told him. The boys watched as Louis clapped Juliana on the back with a soccer ball. Ouch, Juliana shouted. You didn't have to throw it so hard. See ya, Alex said. Chris popped some of his peanuts into his mouth. Just then, 2 chattering squirrels went right past the boys up a tree. George was about to suggest that they throw the squirrels a few peanuts, but before he could even open his mouth, he felt a strange bubbling in the bottom of his belly. Maybe it was a bologna sandwich, or maybe it wasn't. Oh man, not again. George tried to desperately stop the bubbles. He held his nose and clamped his mouth shut. George, what are you doing? Chris asked him. George didn't answer. He was afraid to talk. Those bubbles were strong. George had already kept one inside today, but this one seemed determined to get out. The bubbles ping-ponging their way up out of George's stomach. They ping-ponged their way up to his chest. They ping-ponged their way up his throat, and then... burp! George let out a supersonic burp. It was so loud it made the leaves on the trees shake. Kids clear across the playground could hear it. Whoa, Alex exclaimed. Impressive, Chris added. George opened his mouth and tried to say, excuse me, but those weren't the words that came out. Instead, he said, you know how you catch a squirrel, you climb up a tree and laugh like a cat. And then with that, George's George's feet started running toward the nearest tree. George tried to make his legs go stiff so they couldn't climb. He hugged the trunk of the tree and tried to stay on the ground, but his arms and legs had their own ideas. They wanted to climb the tree, and that next thing he knew, that's exactly what George was doing. "George Brown, get down from there," Mrs. Kelly called out. "You'll hurt yourself." George wanted to get down. He really did, but his feet wouldn't let him. Up, up, up he climbed. "Squeak, squeak, squeaks," George chattered to a squirrel on the branch. But the squirrels didn't understand George's squirrel speak. It scampered away as fast as it could. George's cheeks wanted to have a little squirrely fun. They sucked in a lot of air and blew themselves up like a big balloon. Now George looked like a squirrel storing nuts in his cheeks. Sort of, anyway. "Is he trying to sketch a squirrel?" George heard Chris ask. "He's definitely acting nutty." Alex agreed. They were both laughing really hard. By now the principal, Mrs. McCowan, had come out to the playground. "George Brown, there was no climbing trees during recesses," she called out to him. "You know that." George didn't know that. Unfortunately, the Superbird didn't, and neither did his hands. They weren't about to let his cheeks have all the fun. Before George knew what was happening, the fists were drumming on his chest. "Ah!" George let out a yell. He was no ordinary squirrel. He was a Tarzan squirrel. "George," Mrs. McKenna shouted angrily, "get down this minute!" "Ah!" George shouted even louder. His arms reached out toward a long, thin branch. His feet got ready to push off so he could swing to the next tree. Whoosh! Suddenly, George felt something pop in his stomach. It was like something had punctured a balloon. All the air rushed out of him. The Superbird was gone, but George was still up in that tree. George looked down at the playground. Whew, he was really high up. He grabbed a tree trunk and held on tight. "Get down from there right now, young man," Mrs. McCowan shouted. "Yes, ma'am," George said. Slowly, he began to climb down the tree. Mrs. McCowan and Mrs. Kelly were both waiting for George when he reached the ground. "I'm so disappointed, George," Mrs. Kelly said. She straightened her glasses and wiped a little bead of sweat from under her nose. "You know the recess rules." "What got into you?" Mrs. McCowan asked him. George frowned. It wasn't what got into him that made him act so crazy. It was what slipped out of him. That super burp was really bad. I don't know, ma'am," George said. He looked down at the ground. "I suggest you save your squirrel act for the talent show," Mrs. McCowan told him. "You know the way to my office. Now march." George sighed and followed the principal. Another recess, sitting in the gray metal chair that made your butt fall asleep. Another recess, sitting listening to Mrs. McCowan's pen scratching against papers on her desk. Another recess, staring at the window while the other kids got to play. Thanks everyone for watching. Subscribe and turn on that notification bell so you don't miss Chapter 4. Or like, comment down below. Have a great day. Bye!